Welcome to Garden Views, interesting conversations with interesting people who have done and or are doing interesting things. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome everyone into Garden Views, and this week we are going back into space and the laws of space. Our guest this week is Charlie J.P. Bennett. He is, a colleague of mine of sorts in the Space Court Foundation, which, as many of you know, but probably not all of you, and hopefully every week we get new listeners, is a tax-exempt not-for-profit which is focusing on providing education and information on space law and policy. And one of the primary missions is to get law students and people in other disciplines in that career trajectory getting internships with law firms and space-oriented companies in the private sector, even in the public sector, so that they get career legs up, but also that they can help make a more humane and more cohesive and holistic space law policy organically, sort of from the ground up. Charlie is in the Netherlands. He's in Leiden. He has his LLM in European law and public international law. And as he told me pre-production, I can call him a jurist, which is cool. So thank you for being part of the show. And, obviously you can introduce yourself. Thank you for the invitation,
Jeff. It's lovely to join you, yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, it's great. I love having colleagues from the Space Law Foundation. I mean, first of all, you get people from all over the world, and I've spoken to some of our colleagues from India and other places, talking about the policies of those countries. So I'm not really telling you this. I'm telling the audience that if they want to check out prior shows, they can get to that. What some know and others don't know is that it's this show that led me to the Space Court Foundation, not vice versa. I wanted to learn what the laws of space were and might be, and I started that journey by extrapolating the laws of Earth. And I think I went maybe a little bit further and more holistically than most. I talked to people who ran international airports. I talked to immigration attorneys. I talked to air traffic controllers. I talked to people who dealt with United States federal workers' compensation. Well, it's called the Longshoremen's Act when it deals with the laws of the sea. I talked to a professor of maritime law, as well as some space journalists and some professors on space law and business law. And
that's quite a CV.
And in that, and I'm still looking, by the way, for people in international law enforcement and probably a few other areas as well. And from there, in that, it led me to Space Court Foundation, where both Nathan and Chris were guests on the show, and I guess they both liked me enough that I think Chris has been on twice now. They both liked me enough. They invited me to join Space Court Foundation as general counsel, which I'm happy to volunteer to do. And then they decided, hey, let's make him on the board of directors, like an officer who has a vote and everything, which was new to me because I've been involved in not-for-profits before, tax-exempt entities, where there was separate counsel who, they could always advise the board on what to do and say, but I don't have a vote. It's your decision. I can just tell you if you're going, beyond your bylaws or whatever the case might be. And so this is sort of a new role for me. But this show today is not about me, as it often is not. It's about you. So, Charlie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I live in the Netherlands, as you said, in Leiden, but I'm originally British. I was born in South London and then moved to a town called Hastings, which is sort of famous. Maybe you know it because there was a big battle there, but the French
little battle
in 1066. Yeah, that little incident.
That conqueror guy.
I ended up moving to the Netherlands to do my bachelor in a town called Groningen, which is in the far north of the Netherlands, and then ended up moving to Leiden for my two masters. And Leiden is sort of at least rapidly becoming, it's one of the main sort of space areas, if you like, certainly in Europe, but arguably the world as well. I've had a sort of if you like, a long-standing interest in space. I actually wanted to be a physicist until I decided to leave the country and pursue law instead. International law at that as well. So I've always had this sort of interest with it, and then through various sort of coincidences, it just so happened that I was able to find a way to combine both of those things at the same time doing space law. So, yeah, it's a brilliant.
There's very few things in the world that you could recognize, contemporaneously or in advance that you can get in on the bottom floor, unless you're literally starting a new religion or, a cult, or you believed in like something like Bitcoin early enough, which arguably is its own sort of cult. That's a different story, which we've covered on this show before. But yeah, so I think that's great that you're there because the audience can probably guess it. But I mean, I'm guessing that you're 25 to 30 years younger than me, so this is you're very much in the right time of getting involved in it. Me, it's cool and all, but I probably won't live to see the major developments of what happens, but you probably will, which I think is really, really cool.
Yeah, I think so as well. There's been a lot of development all over the place at the moment, and especially in the past week or so, we've seen some of the sort of directions the development of space is going in, for better or worse, and it's certainly a very exciting time to be involved in the entire field.
Well, maybe this is a good time. Maybe that's a good place to start, and then we can get into your area of expertise. But we don't always do like current events the week in news. So, what are the most recent developments of note that you can touch upon?
Well, I mean, the most concerning, I suppose, thing is the revelation that, or the supposed leak, almost from the White House, that there may be, or that Russia may be pursuing some kind of nuclear weapon or nuclear-based weapon in outer space and having it stationed there, and sort of the legal consequences that will come from that. I'll actually have another blog post up on this on a European platform in a few days from now. But it's certainly a sort of turning point, if you like, with regard to the direction a lot of people thought things were going in terms of the international regulation of space. And this is it's a worrying development from many perspectives. If it's proven to be true, we don't know yet, and there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding the exact nature of it, which really does make a difference in terms of the law, of course.
Of course. Point of clarification: it was actually Congress who leaked it.
My bad.
The White House was none too pleased. They had briefed the members of both houses with the security clearances, and one of the members of Congress said, "This is outrageous. Everybody should know this." But the interesting thing is, this sounds a lot like Strategic Defense Initiative, the Reagan SDI, locally called Star Wars, that we can never make work. Now, granted, that was 40 years ago, thereabouts, and technologies move, but we're seeing in Ukraine in real time that a lot of Russia stuff doesn't work. Now, a lot of it's old, so maybe the new stuff does work pretty good, but I'm having a little trouble believing that they could make this work. I mean, more than half of their, rockets don't work. They don't explode. They don't ignite. To put one in low Earth orbit or middle Earth orbit or whatever, to threaten the ground, terra firma, seems unusual to me, or unlikely. Though, if they could do one to shoot, just to blow up in the 22,000 miles above the atmosphere, that would probably destroy a whole lot of satellites accidentally. But if you shot them at satellites in different directions, you could cause a lot of damage, with that capability.
Yeah, well, I think most likely it's the latter thing, that if they are in development of this weapon, it's the latter that they'll be going after through the means of an EMP. And we've already seen the destructive ability of that with some of the nuclear tests in the 60s, perhaps Starfish Prime, launched by the US, being the sort of the most prominent of those, because it caused such a large electromagnetic pulse, which it turns out actually knocked out a third of the satellites that were currently in orbit. There were only about 23, I think, in orbit at the time. But through the months that followed, as a result of the radiation in the in the orbit, an artificial radiation belt, it caused quite some havoc. And of course, that was back then. Nowadays, there are nearly 8,400, I think, satellites currently up in the atmosphere, or in space, sorry. So the potential for destruction is, of course, much higher, and a great deal of the modern world now relies upon the services and digital services that space infrastructure provides. So, it's more concerning than then. But yeah, I certainly agree that it has to be sort of tempered. One of the things I point out in this article as well is that, if they wanted to just explode a nuke in space, they could put one on an ICBM, and do that quite easily. Perhaps the most important part of such a potential weapon would be the fact that it's undetectable. If they put it up on a separate satellite and nobody knew that the weapon was on it, right, then you would be able to, at the touch of a button, potentially take out a large portion of satellites, which by itself, that ability is a deterrent. And of course, there's been some suggestion and controversy about sort of the utility of a weapon, because of course, if any state did this, they would run the risk of damaging their own satellites in the process. But I think we've seen over the past few years that we cannot rely on the logic that a state wouldn't, at least in part, damage their own reputation, industries, infrastructure, whatever, in pursuit of preventing another state from getting something else. I'm, of course, referring to Ukraine, which has had disastrous consequences for both sides.
Yeah, the only positive I can take from this is with putting in Ukraine into the equation is that you might take the risk of blowing up a satellite and all the residual damage to other satellites that would cause, including your own and your own infrastructure and internet and communications, if you thought you had a dominant conventional force that could wreak havoc and you could take over usable parts of land. I think what Ukraine has showed us is that Russia's conventional forces aren't as dominant as they thought, and they keep getting degraded every day. Whatever happens to Ukraine, I mean, I think that Russia has there's been some estimates that its conventional forces have been reduced by 50%, in some cases 70%. I mean, I don't know where these percentages come from, but I assume that they're based in some form of reality. And
it's a dire situation regardless. Yeah.
But a country like Poland and Germany probably, while they're on guard, they probably think that they'd have a better chance of defending themselves than Ukraine. Plus, they're also NATO countries, so that the rest of us would be obligated to come in, which is the interesting testing ground of Ukraine. But that's a different show. In fact, we've covered that topic with different people as well, but it's interesting that it comes up. So, okay. So the Russian possible Star Wars scenario, that is definitely one of the areas. Were there any other developments this week? I mean, I know that the Chinese have sent something up there. The Japanese might have done a lander. There's all sorts of countries now involved in space. India is involved in space. UAE. So is anything else to report on those things, or should we just dive into your particular area of expertise?
Nothing. I mean, there was, of course, if you extend the period back a couple of months, you've got the Indian lander and then the Japanese lander as well on the lunar surface and the developments from that. But in the past week, apart from the nuclear weapon issue, I don't think there's anything certainly not as significant as that revelation. There was perhaps, although actually thinking about it, there's perhaps the issue of, it turns out that I think it was roughly 100 Starlink satellites will be deorbited due to consistent malfunctions or some kind of error in their use, which is raising questions of sustainability and whether these enormous mega constellations are a good idea in principle, and various other questions sort of to do with that. That's quite a thing to perhaps touch on as well, because there's so many different factors at play here.
It's funny because, I mean, Elon Musk is such a interesting and unique character involved in so many things. I find myself conflicted as to whether I want to root for him or against him. in almost everything. and
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. On the one hand, you can certainly say that there's certainly been some more unsavory things that he's done. Yet at the same time, he is head of the most successful space company ever produced. So
yeah, and electric cars. I mean, we shouldn't give him. I know they're not doing great right now, but he's the one who figured out how to mass produce electric cars, and at least it's for some amount of time make them safe and affordable.
Indeed.
So he's done some things, but he's so braggadocious that when it turns out that his things aren't working so well, it's almost like, you're not so smug now. But it turns out he is still that smug. I guess he just shrugs it off. So anyway, my conversation and what I think about him is only important to me, not to him. So. And it's only a little bit important to me. So, and it is not the topic of this particular show. So, all right. So but I think that all of this does dovetail very nicely into, what you write about most, not solely, of course, but, and I'm not sure if you want to start with sort of the EU space law and EU space policy and then go into dual use or the reverse. It's up to you.
I think we'll go from the reverse, actually. It makes a little more sense that way, because this is one of those things that is just so complex and with various different factors. It almost makes no sense to start at the sort of more broad thing. But the dual use issue is something that is particularly salient in the EU due to the way that it's structured. This isn't something that really you have sort of different forms of it, of the same problem, but not to the same extent as is currently being debated in Europe. And that problem is essentially how to govern dual-use assets. Although there are very many different issues that may arise with governance of them, the EU's own structure, constitutionally at the most fundamental level, really isn't very good at accommodating such systems, because it's we have to sort of go back a little bit into what the EU actually is and start from that also for the benefit of your audience. So the EU it's a supranational entity, and it's not an international organization, and it's not a state either. It is a sort of in-between thing. It is, in fact, sovereign in part. The member states of the EU have transferred some of their sovereign powers to the EU on the basis of what is known as the principle of conferral. They have conferred their powers to the EU, and the EU then executes them according to the mandate that is laid out in the treaties. Everything else that isn't explicitly given to them, to the EU that is, remains with the member states, at least in theory. That is how it's meant to be. But of course there's significant room for interpretation regarding these powers, and this is the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is the highest court in the EU. And this translates to difficulties because there is a difference within the EU system for essentially the powers that it has with regards to some stuff and not others, as a result of this conferral-based system. Because
so it's sort of like it's almost like a mega treaty that has created, almost like a uniform government of certain limited purposes. I think originally it was supposed to be sort of more of a economic zone, but it sort of seems to have exceeded that to an extent. I guess it's exceeded that, except when it doesn't. And I guess it exceeded it enough that the people of your home country, your original home country, England, decided to vote themselves on out. Though I'm not sure, is it just England that did the Brexit thing, or did that also apply to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland?
It's the whole of the United Kingdom that left, which is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
So the rest of the
United Kingdom left. Yeah,
so
the Republic of Ireland still remains
in
the
Iceland.
EU. Yeah.
There and Greenland, I guess, is owned by Denmark. So
Greenland has a strange relationship with the EU. Actually, it's not. It's technically part of Denmark, which is an EU member state, but Greenland itself isn't. it's very complex when it comes
semi-autonomous. So
to
it has an even more attenuated relationship to the EU. But being that Greenland probably doesn't have much of a space program, we probably need not concern ourselves much.
Indeed, no, not as far as I'm aware, at least.
Yeah, but, I mean, who knows what they have hiding under that ice? But I think they're more interested in fishing than exploring the stars. All right. So the EU itself is a bit of a complex, almost like a unicorn type of thing. It exists by agreement, and like most organizations, gets more powerful and sort of expands its tentacles over time. And sometimes the tentacles get stronger and firmer, and other times they sort of get cut up, and other times they just get nipped, like sort of like a manatee with scars from the from boats, but they're still swimming along. So. All right, so I certainly appreciate that background on the EU because while I think I loosely understood what it was, I don't think anyone's ever actually said it in concrete terms before like that, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And given that you're actually there on the ground and studying laws and have studied law, it makes a whole lot of sense. Okay, so what is the EU's role in space vis-a-vis the independent nations, or is it just all EU dominated?
Well, it's certainly not EU dominated, at least not for the minute. The EU is, it sort of pertains to this problem of dual use, is why the EU hasn't done a great deal. There are some legislative initiatives in the pipeline. We're expecting the draft of a new EU space law coming in the sort of end of March, April period. We don't know exactly yet, but there'll be something that comes out then. And then we'll be able to see sort of the compromise that has been, at least within the EU structures, negotiated between the member states of the EU and the EU itself, which is, of course, a separate entity that is self-sustaining and independent, at least from the member states. And then we'll perhaps have some idea of how they've been able to solve this issue of what powers does the EU have and what powers do the member states have? Because the problem at the moment you've got is, the EU and Europe as a whole needs to sort of consolidate its space assets, because at the moment it's very fragmented. You have a distribution of powers between several actors. You have the EU and its space agency, EUSPA, or Agency for the Space Program, it's termed. You have the member state space agencies, and most member states have them. And then you also have the European Space Agency, which isn't part of the EU at all. It's an international organization that has its own separate mandate. So you have all of these different actors that are looking to sort of they all have their own objectives, for one thing, which means that they conflict, at least softly, in some aspects, and aren't necessarily all going in the same direction at once. But this also creates, a degree of uncertainty as regards the laws and regulations and, the applicable requirements for anybody to, for example, launch a satellite or rocket or whatever from European territory. And all of these issues are things that have to be overcome in the face of geopolitical pressures, not least competition from principally the US, which has a dominant market for sure. But then you also have the new space actors such as China, India, Japan, and various others who are also looking to capitalize on, this rapidly growing space industry. And one of the things I've pointed out, as many others, or have many others over the years, is that this fragmentation between all of these different actors will eventually sort of decrease the competitiveness of Europe as a whole, just because it's going in different directions. It's as simple as that. The more complex something is, the more difficult it is to navigate in terms of law and regulation. And so the EU, in some sense, has an incentive from that background to act in a way that is for the benefit of the entire continent, whether that be to harmonize its law and policy in certain areas, or otherwise make regulations that allow for the bottom-up development of new industries and things, whether that be through direct grants or less red tape and bureaucracy, these kind of things. and ultimately to establish a sort of continental-wide market, which is, as you alluded to earlier, the original purpose of the EU. It's an economic union, is what it started as, and it was designed to build a market that was far bigger than just France or Germany or then the UK. And you would,
let's face it, the US. It was there to create something.
Yeah, exactly.
A free trade zone that either rivaled or at least was a safety net to not be so dependent upon the US.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's one of the.
For you on this, there's a lot of treaties out there that certain countries have joined and haven't joined. Most of them predate the EU existing period, but there's things like the use of space, International Use of Space Treaty, the Moon Treaty. Do individual countries, did they ratify it, or does the EU re-ratify them? Does the EU have the power to ratify or sign onto treaties for all of the participating countries, or is that a step too far? Or is that like a gray area where they might do it and it depends if anyone objects, or does nobody know?
No, that's an excellent question. And actually, this question also pertains to the dual use divide that we've sort of mentioned a few times now. The EU is able to conclude international agreements and treaties with other countries, organizations, whatever, with respect to treaties that concern competences that it has been given. So if the EU has an exclusive competence to act in a certain area, it can then act internationally, sort of derivative from that, on behalf of all of its member states, which have essentially pooled their sovereignty, given that to the EU, which then acts on their behalf in their collective interest. But this isn't the case in all areas, and here we see the sort of dual use thing coming along, is that, for example, in the area of security and defense, the powers of the EU are a lot more limited, which means that the EU doesn't have exclusive competence to act in these areas. And as a result, the member states remain free to conclude their own agreements, so long as in doing so they don't inadvertently counter or go against some sort of more fundamental norms of the EU. There are certain principles, for example, of loyal cooperation, which is essentially the member states cannot act in a way which undermines the objectives that the EU are pursuing in a particular area. So there's a lot of grey in this, indeed, and this is why it's so complicated.
So when you say dual use, there's actually, it's almost like there's dual use in the use of the term. Probably more than that if the more versed one gets into it. My primitive understanding of dual use until this show was the use of space and vehicles or vessels into space for peaceful purposes. But what is peaceful versus, if something can, what's the right word? Broadcast a radio signal, is it just broadcasting a radio signal, or can it also broadcast a jamming signal? If there's a crew and they're armed, is that for military use or is that for policing use? I mean, the Coast Guard and the police, they're armed, to protect and to serve. Now, I understand that in different communities and different situations, people may just, feel that the police don't exactly protect and serve all the time. And maybe some folks think they don't protect and serve any time. But there is a distinction, I think, in international law and domestic laws in policing versus military. But if you're carrying a sidearm or a shotgun or anything else, is it even a knife? A knife, a Swiss Army knife, with 12 different functions. That's a weapon. So, what is dual use when you're the only people in space, or there's only 12 people in space total, and 2 of them have sidearms? I mean, does it matter if they say we're there to protect and serve, or if they decide to change their minds? All of a sudden it's there for hostile intent. So that was my understanding of dual use. Now, in listening to you, dual use is even larger than just that. It is whether or not the political ambitions of any particular state matches with the international agreement of those states, and specifically maybe the EU, whether the interests of, say, France or Germany or Liechtenstein are adverse to the interests of the EU writ large. But maybe I saw your face, so maybe I got that wrong.
Yeah, well, I totally understand how they're dual in the sense that they're separation of powers, but I wouldn't equate them to dual use in terms of the legal designation of a particular service or good or item. The EU has sort of a separation between what we'll call civilian competences and military competences. And those are actually relevant for the governance of dual use very intimately. I wouldn't necessarily characterize them as dual use sort of laws or policies or those kind of things, but they do illustrate what the problems are in sort of regulating dual use items and goods. I mean, in the space context, the easiest example would be, for example, an observation satellite that has, higher resolution cameras direct on the ground, maybe coupled with a spectrometer or some other an analytical piece of equipment. These, in the civilian case, could be used to, aid in city planning, for example, or perhaps with a spectrometer, they can see the chemical composition of particular farmlands so they know where to put fertilizer or change the makeup of the fertilizer, that kind of thing. But at the same time, you could also use those cameras to, for example, as has been seen in Ukraine, have real-time or near real-time reconnaissance of the battlefield down, looking at from the satellites. So the dual use in this instance and in the way that I'm referring to is essentially based off of purpose. Can it be used for a civilian purpose and can it be used for a military purpose? But that sort of distinction aside, that fits quite nicely with, or not nicely, but it causes problems with the way the EU is governed, because the EU is conferred lots of things for the purpose of civilian things, but not for defense. Of course, the member states have given the EU some sovereignty in some areas, but they haven't given all of their sovereignty. And they certainly want to keep their own sovereign. What the core of sovereignty is the ability to defend oneself, right? Certainly as a country. And so though that aspect they want to keep, and the member states haven't transferred that power to the EU. But does that then mean that the EU is totally unable to regulate space assets because they can be used for military purpose? Now that's a very difficult question that comes down to essentially the distinctions of the EU itself draws between how to govern those two and the interpretation of its own power, if you like. And it's then when you get into the interpretation of its own power that it becomes a lot more controversial. I hope that made some sense. But
no, you make perfect sense. There's just so many things that, I mean, okay. So there's a show, I think it's done now on Netflix, called Space Force. So it's basically a parody, but apparently the parody isn't that far from some realities. And in the season finale, I think about season 2. I never watched season 3. Basically, a Chinese satellite or vessel flew up to a U.S. satellite, and basically a giant scissor came out of it and cut one of the satellite's solar panels off. So the satellite can no longer power itself. It was useless. Mm-hmm. Now and I thought that was absurd until I heard some other space podcast saying that they're, in some of the efforts to protect satellites from space debris, they were thinking of things like saws to disentangle them, or the French were talking about almost like giant crab claws, or like a giant net that would catch the debris, or like a meteor that was coming forward, or a meteorite, or whatever. Well, I guess it's a meteor at that point, small asteroids. But you could also see that, I mean, it's not a butterfly net, so you could also see that same net or that saw being used to trap another satellite or satellite, or to, I mean, so even these sort of what we think are comical, cartoonish uses, turns out they're practical. They're easy. It's easier to make a giant net or put a saw on a satellite than it is a laser beam that'll shoot something down. It's also cheaper, and there's a lot of room to maneuver up there. But it's completely dual use, or probably not be argued as dual use. The government or the agency involved would say, "Oh no, we're using this we're using this to catch asteroids." And really, it's actually going to help all of us. It's not going to help you. And then it's a question of, does the U.S. trust the EU? Probably. Do we trust Russia? Probably not. Do we trust China? I don't know. What's in their interest these days, and how do you figure that out? And what do they think of these days? I mean, my understanding of Chinese policy is that their view of these days is a lot longer than, say, Western. But maybe that's just one of those romantic myths that different people have about different people. Which can be used both positively and negatively at the same time. So I don't know. Are these things that in the halls of academia and in your professional career that people actually discuss, or is it on a different sort of higher level?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, which is essentially all, or at least the vast majority of space objects, assets could be classified as dual use. That much is certain. The sort of difficulty then becomes, well, is that the only distinction we make between them? Do we just say, oh, they have both military or civilian purpose, or these things can be in phases as well. Think of and you've mentioned a couple of examples there, but for example, an oxygen tank. Now, that an oxygen tank is predominantly used for humans to breathe, for example, or perhaps as rocket fuel. And yes, you could conceive of a situation in which you let the valve off next to an enemy satellite and let it crash into it, something like that. But is that actually sort of feasible? It's perhaps yes, but to a much lower degree. And so for the purposes of actually regulating it, you need to have sort of more distinctions about at what point do we then interfere at a regulatory way? What's the threshold of risk, if you like, where an object or asset, whatever it is, becomes so easy to use as a offensive weapon or other military asset that now we have to take action? And that question, although a little simpler for other states, would be, do we take action against it or not? For the EU, that is, are we able to regulate its development on the ground or not? So it filters down a lot more, it then becomes a lot more complex.
Let's take the recent news that you talked about, the Russian strategic arms initiative, their Star Wars, and let's just assume for the moment it is true and it has a reasonable chance of working, and everyone says to them, "Hey, you are threatening us," and they're like, "No, we are not. We're not going to point it at the Earth. We're going to point it outside, because when Apophis comes by, or there's some asteroid that nobody detected until it was too late, we're going to be able to target it and shoot nukes at it." So yeah, you've been playing around with launching satellites to nudge asteroids off course, but you have to find them first, and you don't have like a warehouse full of these things ready to go into orbit and target. We'll be there. We'll be in space, and we're going to save the Earth. And then you have like maybe someone whose name rhymes with Lucker Arlson, or Arnold Ump, saying the Russians are great. Look how great the Russians are. They're here to save white Christians and everyone else. Oops, my politics got involved. My politics that is no secret. Other things, although I might keep things secret, but. Anyway, is that something that would fly, or what do you do about it? I mean, if the thing is in the sky, what can you possibly do about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there has to be a sort of there's a big differentiation between sort of in the way that I sort of conceived of dual use. It's in terms of sort of when are we able to regulate something? And the EU is famously a big regulator. There's an old joke which is like what is it? It's something along the lines of, if a new thing is invented, the Americans go, how can we innovate it? And the Russians say, how can we weaponize it? The Europeans go, well, how can we regulate it? They like their sort of, we like having rules. What can we say? But yeah, there's certainly a difference between the sort of the decision whether or not to regulate something from a legal perspective and the decision politically whether or not to intervene sort of diplomatically or something.
The innovate thing sort of is the stepchild of both the European and the Russian. I mean, the innovate is how do we weaponize it and regulate it sort of at the same time and strike the balance. So we sort of have the yin and yang of both sides of the Eurasian divide.
I agree. Yeah, for sure. But to be fair, the sort of the factors that you consider whether to act politically or whether you are, at least in the EU's case, able to regulate something are actually quite similar in the sense that it's the degree to which something's likelihood is that it can be used as a military thing. So they're both different, but also quite similar, as you said.
So dominant use.
Respects.
So if the oxygen tank is on the International Space Station and there's astronauts on there, or cosmonauts, or whatever the word is for particular countries, of course, you're going to be more likely to believe that the dominant use is, probably to contribute to breathable air, and perhaps for steering purposes if need be in emergency.
Exactly.
If it's on a satellite where there's nobody on it, where oxygen isn't necessarily part of the functionality, you're wondering what the heck it's up there for. Now, but then comes, but of course what we do, what you do, and what Space Court Foundation, I think is trying to do and does do, or at least some of the individuals are thinking in these veins, is you have to extrapolate into the future. So let's just say, I don't know what it's going to be. Probably, let's say in 25 to 50 years, there's manned travel in space, whether it's for commerce, short-term, long-term, whether they're building colonies or mining or just scientific experiments like, sort of like a la Antarctica in space, there'll be more people out there. So there's going to be more of these places where, hey, if you're going to have people from 6 different countries up there and there's 30 people, you do need a sheriff, and the sheriff's going to have, a gun or a blackjack or a taser or something. And, again, if you're the sheriff and you have one deputy, I mean, and they develop a drinking problem, all of a sudden their law and order becomes into abuse. And, and if that, let's just make it, whenever I have a straw person, bad guy country, I use myself, Jeffzikistan. So let's just say that the sheriff and deputy are from Jeffzikistan, and it's me. It's actually me, and I drink too much scotch, which is probably what would happen if I was stuck on the moon for a while, and I go bad, and
understandable to be fair.
Exactly, and then start abusing my power. I mean, have I now decided to claim the place for Jeffzikistan? Is it now, has the something that was for peaceful use, the protect and serve and keep order, and I've turned it into the mechanism of chaos. Of course, in my own mind and mighty, proud Jeffzikistan, this is just a natural order. We must dominate because we are the best. But this dual use has turned into what I think the other 29 people and the other 5 countries would think is now military use.
Yeah, potentially, yes. I mean, if you assume that the, say, European states had jurisdiction over a particular colony or space station, whatever it is, and then, if a weapons system of some kind was going up there would then be the question of, well, under whose jurisdiction is this? Is this something that the EU is able to regulate, or is it something that the member states are able to regulate? And if it's the member states, you would then have a lot of fragmentation and differences between, between France, Germany, say, let's throw England there as well, just for example's sake, all of which have very different sort of guns and weapons laws. And, if it was a joint venture, how are you to know which laws apply? These are very complex questions, and they don't have an answer yet.
And if some schnook like me can think about this on a podcast, there's some Air Force generals or the equivalent of Air Force generals who are thinking the same thing, going, okay, well, Jeffzikistan has the sheriff and the deputy, but just in case, we're going to have you sneak. See these compartments here? You can put them together into a projectile, John, but people look at it, it's just going to look like they're plastic components. Probably every country, so there might be like 16 other secret weapons up there, in addition to things like flashlights and wrenches and crowbars and other regular tools.
Or maybe they'll give you a 3D printer and the ability to print it yourself while you're up there. Similar
all of the plans involve 3D printers. I mean, if nothing else, to make the habitats. But you're right; you can adjust the 3D printer to print anything, and if it can print habitats and landing pads, it can certainly print a Mossberg shotgun.
Yeah. Yeah,
or bow and arrow.
I mean, that would be a very interesting thing to see, actually. I wonder how maybe not the string, but certainly the bow and the arrow. It's certainly good.
Well, you could bring the string with you, or a bungee. I mean, weren't bungees invented for space?
Sneak it in somehow. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean,
maybe you could use the excuse that you're tying yourself to your bed so you don't float away while you're in zero gravity. And then
I think the bungees were actually invented for space use, like Velcro. But anyway, I mean, wouldn't an arrow piercing a space suit, an environmental suit, if you're outside, be as fatal as someone blowing your head off?
Yeah. I don't know the exact physics behind it, to be honest with you, but from what I know, if it was enough to pierce the suit and manage to even a glancing blow in that case, if it just opened a pressure differential, then it would be essentially as fatal as being shot in the face.
Probably a whole lot more painful.
Interesting question.
Yeah, so you don't even need a gun. You just need a crossbow with I mean, it's like anything, a bolt cutter, right? I mean, anything, and so. I don't know how, if you're doing something internationally, unless you absolutely trust your partners, and who absolutely trusts their partners with anything. I mean, that's why we have courts on Earth, because nobody can absolutely trust their partners, including your spouses. I mean, isn't that what divorce is? I don't know how everyone would agree to go up unarmed and, Ronald Reagan trust but verify. But how do you verify with 3D printers? And I mean, it's like this swirling circle of headache that is beyond my intellectual capacity to grasp, or maybe I'm grasping it exactly right, that there is no perfect solution.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's a mess. It is a real mess, and it isn't clear at all how that is going to be regulated in the future. I mean, to some extent, we're talking about things that are only really going to be relevant in a few decades from now. But nonetheless, they are questions that have to be answered, because whoever or whatever entity sets the regulation of those kind of things, well, that could last for, as a premise, could last for, well, as long as the human race does, potentially. So, in a sense, yes, it is a question of who gets there first, who is able to regulate it first, and then they would then have the privilege and the enormous responsibility of dictating for the rest of humanity what and how we are able to govern ourselves with those things.
Right. And as an American and a Brit, we probably don't have the best historical moral standing as saying this, but if people considered these things decades before the British East India Company, or decades before the American notion of manifest destiny, maybe there wouldn't have been like genocides and land grabs and resource exploitation back then. Sure. That people look back and go, God, they were evil. What were they thinking about? I mean, right now we're sort of doing the same things. I mean, we don't know who or what is out there in space, but there's going to be something there that there's always winners and losers. And what we're trying to do is figure out a way to overcome human nature, or what's been human nature, and become what we idealize our nature as human to be. So, I mean, I don't think things that are in decades in the future are, that I don't think kicking it down the can has ever been a good strategy for anyone in any situation, including
certainly not
preemptive. The old question of would you kill baby Hitler? Yes, I would kill baby Hitler. It's yes, I would. I'm sorry, but anyway, forget about.
Also, type back in what you said as well. I mean, the old maxim is, the only thing necessary for bad guys to succeed is for good people to do nothing. And good people tend to do nothing when they don't have the information accessible. And you get that information by having thought exercises such as this one and, doing something about it. So it's certainly a worthwhile thing to talk about.
I agree. But let's get out of me and all of my hypotheticals. As fun as that is, and as much as the host of the show, I get to blather on as much as I like. But I don't know that we've gone, specifically into any of the topics that you've actually written on. I'm sure there's some things that are very important that you would like to speak about.
Well, the main thing I've sort of my main focus is to do with European space affairs, which is it's quite niche in the sense that there are many unique problems. Most of it's to do with things like the fragmentation between lots of different entities, and these are issues that simply don't occur in, for example, the US. In the US, you have NASA, and then NASA subcontracts certain things to SpaceX or various other subcontractors. But all of the objectives and policy directions, all of that is collected and is in the form of NASA. But in Europe, we don't have that. We have a space agency for each member state. We then have the European Space Agency, which acts only in civilian aspects of some of those space agencies, also including some members that are not of the EU, by the way, such as the UK, which is a member of the European Space Agency, but not the EU and its space agency. And then you have the EU itself, which is meant to act and tries to act as a as a supranational entity that acts in the collective interests of all European states. So there's so many different factors at play. Trying to unravel this to a degree that allows Europe to still be competitive in these kind of very high risk, cutting edge science domains is very, very hard. And that's what because of that, that's sort of what I have focused on predominantly in my writings over the past year or so, pretty much. And as another thing to mention, hiya, Jeff. Sorry about that. Very odd. It just crashed, and then I tried to load it up again, and it said it couldn't find the hard drive. I've never had that happen before, but very, very strange.
All right. Well, I just never stopped letting it record because I myself am a bit of a tech idiot. So, Viv, obviously you're going to have a long line to edit, including this out. So, 3, 2, 1. Okay, folks, thanks for bearing with us. We had some tech issues. I don't know if you'll notice any of it after the editing, but if you heard a bit of something falling on Charlie's end, and he was about to say the interesting situation with Ukraine or something to that effect, we lost him at that point, and so it took a few minutes to get the connection back together. So here we are, and that's sort of where we left off with you. So hopefully you can recapture your thought.
Yeah, well, I think I was talking about the, if I remember correctly, the sort of the essentialness that this space apparatus has been to the military campaign in Ukraine, and especially the Ukrainian armed forces. Although the Russians are no doubt also using space-based information to conduct their war, the Ukrainians have it's been reliant on especially Starlink, actually developed by SpaceX, in order to mount an offensive and have real-time strategic communications that allow for large battlefield tactics. It's a very interesting time to be sort of involved in this, and especially the defense side of it as well, because there's so many different aspects of it. And I was above that, I believe I was talking about sort of my focuses as an academic in this area. And this is, of course, essential to the EU. What the result of the war in Ukraine will have a massive effect on the EU, and it already has. We've seen Germany, for example, and has, or at least for many years, it had a tiny defense budget, which is now sort of, ballooned by many, many billions of euros. It's, long term, it's a sort of a U-turn in that effect that the Germans are remilitarizing. And for a long time, that was a sort of missing link in the puzzle, if you like, because Germany is, of course, by quite some margin, the largest economy in Europe at all. So not having a, military not having a military as part of that was it leads to difficult situations, and so this sort of crosses over into the space domain, because space is, of course, in many ways a military endeavor as it is a civilian one. And we've already discussed the extent to which militaries are reliant upon space infrastructure. And the hope is that through this consolidation of all these European regulations and the objectives between the different actors, that we'll be able to, and in addition to the backing of Germany and other actors within the EU, the nations which have finally realized that their defense is something that they have to take seriously, especially in the current geopolitical climate. We'll see a lot more focus on space as a means of defending Europe's self as well, not only as a civilian endeavor. And that puts a lot of pressure on the EU as a supranational entity in order to do something to allow this to happen. And ensure we have the sort of the consolidated and open markets that are necessary to get the expertise and innovation required to build those kind of large high-tech infrastructures that we will definitely need in the future.
I have two items that I want to run by you, and one, it's so obvious that nobody, I don't know that I've heard anyone actually address it, and perhaps there's a answer for it. The other one may not be in your direct area at all, but recently, one of the countries that pulled out of the treaty, I think, that was talking about the non-exploitation of space resources, was Saudi Arabia, which, to my knowledge, has no space program whatsoever. So now I know UAE does, but they're different countries and their interests are aligned in a lot of ways. But I'm sure their interests are different in a lot of ways. But what I do know, what Saudi Arabia has a lot of, is fossil fuels, which, if you believe prevailing science, that's going to be phased out over the next several decades or century. And then what they have a lot of is a lot of drilling and piping and other equipment that perhaps could have a dual use that they might need to be needed somewhere else, repurposed for space use. I'm not sure if it's the same quality of material, etc. But why would a country like Saudi Arabia, with no space program, pull out of a space treaty?
Which treaty are you referring to that it pulled out of?
That is the problem. I'm not sure. I think it is the Moon Treaty. I think it was the treaty where but it was an international treaty on the peaceful use of space. But it was also one that was talking about that no country or entity could, meaning even a private entity, could claim sovereignty over any celestial body and exploit their resources. Right.
Yeah. Well, it all boils down to, essentially, as far as I'm aware, and this isn't. This is getting into the discipline of sort of macro space economics, if you like. But one of the key points in the regulation of the space industry as a whole is that you have to have sufficient. You can't overburden the industry through regulation, because otherwise it'll be stifled and there won't be as much innovation and there won't be as much incentive. And that's the real main point here. There won't be as much incentive to go to space in the first place. At the moment, the system is, of course, driven by profit. Companies want to build these equipment, space vehicles, whatever, to go and do something that makes money, whether that be asteroid mining, lunar mining, all of these things. But in order to raise the funds to do so, they have to expect a return. and they can't get that return if they are then barred from exploiting the resources that they may encounter. There would be no.
That's a really good point, and I'm sorry to speak over you. But it made me think of something that I'm in my mid-50s, so I lose thoughts if I don't. So I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just trying not to forget something. But you're exactly right. There's incentive, and it may not be my repurposing thing. It may be that Saudi Arabia is trying to lure a private entity like a SpaceX or a Blue Horizons or a Virgin or whatever to either move to Saudi Arabia or open a division or a separate corporation, which is, really affiliated in Saudi Arabia so that they can, so Saudi Arabia is their home state. And, I guess they've got plenty of money there. But if they want to invest in this kind of program, then they can partner with, let's just say, a Shmilan Shmushk. And Shmilan can still have, let's just say, Space Y in the United States, but he could have, Star Z in Saudi Arabia, through a bunch of shell countries or whatever, or companies, or maybe he doesn't even care. Maybe he's like, nobody can stop me anyway. There's nothing wrong with doing this. I didn't sign any contracts with NASA about exclusivity, and they didn't sign any with me. Nobody thought about that. And so Saudi Arabia imports a private space program, but they become investors in it and yield in the gain. And maybe repurposing some of their equipment or whatever is part of the plan, but maybe it's not. Maybe they just want to invest in something in the future so that when people stop using oil, they stay rich.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's certainly a plausible explanation for why that has happened. Saudi Arabia investing. I think the other big thing it's investing in at the moment is football. All of these things that it wants to sort of invest in to have an income in the future, because most of its income is oil based, of course. And just FYI, Norway is doing similar things in many respects because its riches are also derived ultimately from North Sea oil. That's why Norway is so rich. It certainly wasn't in the 60s before it was discovered.
Damn it, Norway! I thought you guys were nice.
Yeah. Well, they to their credit, they've certainly taken some initiatives that are world leading in, for example, the environmental sector. But ultimately, it comes at a price.
So they're nice Vikings, but they're still Vikings.
Yeah, it is perhaps a way of putting it. Yeah. No, I have a lot of affection on Norway. I spent a great deal of time last year, actually, in Norway, quite near to the new spaceport, which you may have heard is open, Andøya spaceport, which they're hoping to launch satellites from in the far north.
Please call it Dubai for us. Please call it Dubai for us. Please call it Dubai for us.
That's a very good suggestion. But back to the sort of more general point of the issue of incentive and things. Perhaps interesting thing to know is that if you look in the terms and conditions of Starlink, SpaceX's one of its flagship projects, you will find a provision in there that says, by using this service, you agree or concede that private companies and SpaceX in particular are totally allowed to exploit anything that they like on Mars. So you can already see this sort of contradicts the narrative and norms within the Outer Space Treaty, that there can't be national appropriation, whereas this says that there can be appropriation, at least of that kind, and by a private entity. And Musk has been very open in that his ambition is to have turn the human race into a multi-planetary species, and that a Mars colony would be entirely independent from one on Earth. So, so incentives for SpaceX are a little bit different, but because at least while it's headed by Musk. But yeah, the point of having incentive is a very important one, and actually, equally, you can't have regulations that get in the way of exploiting that incentive, if you like, that extraction that can be taken from it, and that's another point that is. Very salient in Europe at the moment is, providing as best a platform for this to happen. That doesn't actually mean, well, it's kind of ironic because in the EU regulating and introducing more regulation, it actually defragments and simplifies the playing field that companies or whatever entity that wants to go to space may experience when in Europe. Because at the moment it's fragmented between all of these different entities. If the EU was given the power to, it won't happen, but say it was given the power to introduce a comprehensive, all-encompassing space regulation, then that, although it would introduce a new regulation, would actually be less burdensome in terms of regulation than what we currently have.
Interesting. The other thing I wanted to raise, and there may be a very simple answer to this on two fronts, but I mean, everybody knows that there's spy satellites up there. And are all spy satellites under the guise of like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or weather satellites, or called communication satellite, and everyone just looks the other way? Or are there actually spy satellites and there's some exception in international law for, I guess what is understood the countries are going to do one way or another? Or is it just not talked about, period?
Well, I think as a first thing, we certainly don't know everything that is up there. That's, classified information from multiple countries.
Well, there's the Black Knight and the alien moon base and the Andorrans and the Andromedans.
Of course,
and the
exactly.
Syrians,
and the Star Destroyer and all of these things.
Death Star, of course.
Built, almost fully operational.
That belongs to Jeffzikistan.
Yeah. Sorry, can you say the question again? I've got a little bit.
Spy satellites.
Thing about spy satellites. Yeah,
are they a big secret, a known, an accepted exception, or are they all under the guise of being some sort of telecommunications or weather satellite?
No, there's no specific regulation that prohibits satellites of this kind from being up there. It's the main thing that's the one thing that is explicitly forbidden from being up there is weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons. That's why the thing with
this
Russia
is not a pen is mightier than the sword. This is not information as power kind of thing. We're talking physical kinetic power as power.
I wouldn't say that necessarily. All the satellite, at least the vast majority of them up there are, they're either communications or observation, remote sensing, spectroscopy type satellites. They certainly have their different uses, but predominantly it's certainly information that it makes the space arena so important, whether that be on your own turf or the turf of any potential adversary. That's it's reconnaissance and, the ability to sort of sense, for example, incoming launches, whether they be ICBMs or cruise missiles, those kind of things. That's, at least in the military perspective, that's what it's mostly used for.
So reconnaissance, so that would be considered not dominantly for the purposes of war. It's one of those things that's recognized, whether it's because of a wink or actually recognized as informational purposes are not necessarily for war. In fact, they might be to avoid war.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. And you could even argue that having those things there is it allows all parties involved to verify each other, and there's less.
Yeah, and I'm not talking from a moral or whether Jeff and Charlie agree. I'm talking on what the treaty says on this, if anything, or what EU space policy says on this thing. Because that is your area. It's sort of unfair to ask you about anything beyond that. For your expertise, for conversation purposes, and it's all fair game, but to actually ask for your expertise. Is there an EU stated policy on this from the space agency, or is it just something like those horses are already out of the stable?
Although I don't think the EU itself hasn't introduced a specifically legally binding policy that says we cannot do insert activity, whatever it is, maybe to do with space sustainability. Many of the member states themselves have publicly committed to doing so, as has the European Space Agency. So even here, we can see the sort of fragmentation between the different entities. And although the EU certainly recognizes and wants space to remain a peaceful arena and doesn't want to weaponize it, it's no doubt accepted that there are no doubt government satellites up there that are used for military communications and these kind of things, a big target that essentially orbits every 90 minutes. But there isn't a definitive, again, this is going back to the original problem, there isn't a definitive, this is the European policy. It's spread out over several different entities. On something like sustainability, things are a bit more cohesive. Generally, for example, all countries within the EU have committed to not conducting anti-satellite weapon tests, as was done in 2021 by Russia, created a load of space debris, these kind of things. The United States has committed to the same thing, as far as I'm aware. But outside of
India did the same thing.
I think, exactly. And China has done the same thing, if I remember correctly. Or maybe it hasn't. Not 100% sure on that, actually. But there are certainly other actors.
I think they reserved the right to do it. I don't think they actually did it, but I know India did it, which, by the way, was like the perfect cover for, because if there's any damage to any satellites or anything up there before, if it wasn't natural in origin, you could have said, well, Russia, this is your fault. There's there is that treaty that allocates blame to the launching state.
The launching state.
But now there's reasonable doubt that it's at least 50-50 chance that India did it. So how do you prove that in any way?
Yeah, well, you've touched on something that is also a very salient problem in space law, which is the issue of liability. And, the treaties were made in the 60s. The Liability Convention says that, whoever launched it is the one that is responsible for any damage. But if you then have a chain reaction of different debris crashing into each other, some of which perhaps isn't even tracked, so you don't know from whom it's come, how on earth are you meant to assign liability as a result of, say, a debris crash if you don't know the exact sequence of events that led up to that collision in the first place? It's almost impossible. And this is another big issue.
I've not gotten satisfactory answers on scenarios that probably did not exist in the 60s that exists now. I mean, I think it's pretty clear.
Well, exactly.
NASA launches a satellite from Cape Canaveral, that it's the United States launching. And even if it's, SpaceX launching from Cape Canaveral in Florida, it's the United States launching. But if it's Russia's vessel, but they're still using the spaceport in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is launching, but it's a Russian vehicle, or it's a SpaceX vehicle, or Blue Horizons, or Virgin, or Jeffzikistan Spaceways. Who's launching? Is the launching state Jeffzikistan? Is it Russia who contracted with SpaceX? Is it SpaceX, which is in the state, or is it Kazakhstan, where it's actually physically launching from? Which is the launching state? I mean, I've spoken to law professors. They say, well, all of them. Okay, well, that makes sense when there's a car crash, and maybe that would work, but maybe it wouldn't. This is, we're trying to apply the laws of Earth to the laws of not Earth. And and what's the appellate court? What's the Supreme Court of the world to decide the definition of launching state? Because I'm not sure that anyone can satisfactorily answer except saying that everybody's responsible, or at least both states are responsible. I don't know what's the case. And what if it is Jeffzikistan, and Jeffzikistan for $100 million a year say you can launch whatever you want on our ground, and we grant you sovereign immunity. You're liable. And we're not part of that treaty. You sue Jeffzikistan, your defense is Jeffzikistan says that we have sovereign immunity. So you sue Jeffzikistan in the World Court, but we're not part of the World Court, and we don't care. We have our own Jeffzikistan coin, our own fake money that only 16 countries recognize, and that's enough for us. We import oil and grapefruits and pineapples, and that's it. The rest of it we can take care of ourselves for. I mean, I know these are silly examples, but I think the scenarios. But these are like law school exam things, and I'm not sure that there are satisfactory, uniform answers to these things. And I don't expect, Charlie Bennett to answer them either, any better than I can answer them. But it's there's just so many loopholes. I mean, I've said this a million times on the show, which I'm exaggerating right now, but we don't even agree upon where the atmosphere ends and space begins.
Yeah, I mean, technically not. I mean, most countries would say it's 100 kilometers, but that's not a total consensus. You're totally
Right,
correct.
and 100 kilometers. I'm from the United States. That's like 12 feet, right? I have no idea what 100 kilometers. Uh,
62 miles it is exactly. Well, not exactly, but
yes,
thereabouts.
or not exactly. Yeah, no, I'm aware of the Canaan line, or
Common
Kanaa.
line, yeah.
Yeah, Canaan, not Canaan like the Canaanites, but which is another favorite topic of mine. But the Canaanites in space. I mean, anybody with the MCU, the Skrulls sort of are the Canaanites of space. All right.
Mhm.
I see myself getting increasingly more ridiculous, and I don't know that that's, I don't know Charlie well enough to know that if that's something he wants to play along with or not. But I'm
No,
gonna
I'm totally open to it. To be quite honest with you, I think it's really funny.
well, maybe another time we can discuss the Scrolls' plight and their refugee status and things like that. That's more Garden of Doom than Garden Views. I'm very versatile, as you could probably tell, or chaotic, whichever it is. Is there
Whichever
anything?
sounds better.
Yeah, well, versatile does sound better, but chaotic is probably truer. Is there anything that we didn't talk about, or I talked over that you didn't get to? And if people can follow you, read your stuff, support you, where can they find you and follow you? And then we can plug whatever you like, including if you like Space Court Foundation.
Yeah, sure. Well, you could certainly. I'll start with sort of is there anything else for starters? Not really. I mean, my main focus is on the EU and its endeavour into space and how it's sort of negotiating with the member states and the European Space Agency in order to achieve this. It's a very complicated issue, and there's lots of different factors as we've discussed quite extensively. But we've certainly covered the basics of why it's a problem, and then you can extrapolate that into, so you have this constitutional division between military competencies on the one hand and civilian competencies on the other, and since space assets are both of those at the same time, and the EU makes a divide between them, on which divide do they fall? One perhaps interesting thing to note is that for the purposes of European law, of course, the EU and its court, the European Court of Justice, gives itself a sort of favourable interpretation of that division. The current case law suggests that if a asset or good item, whatever it is that is dual use, unless it is specifically a military asset that was developed for a military purpose, even if it's even if it was created as a civilian asset and now is used for a military purpose, it doesn't matter. It has to be purely a military thing, otherwise it's considered civilian. Now, this gives the EU considerable power because that enlarges the breadth of its power because it has ability to regulate only the civilian things. So it's given a widening of the interpretation of what constitutes a civilian asset. But the member states won't be happy about this because if you were to follow this reasoning, and in this case it was only a very minor piece of equipment used in, I think it was a Finnish case. At least that's the one I talked about in my blog that you referenced. But if you were to extrapolate that to the rest of the industry, then you would have the EU taking over a unallowable degree of the member states' own autonomy in this area. So there is a lot of tension, and I've in the past few months I've spoken to various government officials through conferences of the German Defense Ministry and various other places it's crystal clear that the member states do not want the EU interfering in their own domestic security concerns. It's as simple as that. And space assets and the services that are derived from it are an essential part of that. So, it's an ongoing discussion, and there's a lot of things to... it perhaps isn't as interesting to the American audience, but certainly in Europe, it's an extremely salient question, one we have to figure out ourselves, essentially, by coming to some kind of compromise between all of these different institutions.
Well, it's interesting to me. And you know what? I'm the one who gave you 3 questions, but I'm kicking myself because I didn't think of 2 other things that seem to tie into this. where does NATO fit in, if at all, and where does the United Nations fit in, if at all?
Yeah, well, those are two very good questions. Well, to be very, very brief, the UN isn't really involved in this. It is in the sense that you have the international treaties that are UN treaties, and they are, decided at the UN level, but not in. They set the international rules, and then you've got the process of how do international rules sort of fit in within the European structure, because international rules are directly applicable in some legal systems of the member states, the so-called monist interpretation of international law. In some states, they have to be implemented through a domestic law, which turns those international treaty into an act that the state can actually use. And in the case of the EU, it's actually a mix of both of those things at the same time. Mm. So again, it's just another layer of complexity that has to be overcome. And then in the case of NATO, there has been, in terms of rhetoric, a distinction between both of these things. NATO is the primary defense apparatus of Europe, no question. But nonetheless, we are entering domains where NATO and Europe are increasingly both involved. And to echo back to what I said at the very beginning, with this, with the threat of the Russian nuclear weapon in space, this is something that applies to both of those things. The Europeans and NATO have to do something about this if it turns out to be true. But the NATO, EU, and ESA distinction is certainly not cut and dry, not by any means. Very complex relationships, and they go through the member states. So ultimately, it's down to them. And just as a sort of final point to include the Space Corps Foundation in this, one of the things we're focusing on is sort of education to the policymakers of the individual member states or any other states, for understanding what all of these different factors are and, what the consequences long-term will be if certain factors win out over others. I'll tell you, when I was I was speaking at a conference, a closed conference in Germany in November, and in this conference there were officials from various member states of the EU and of the European institutions, so, from the EU itself. And I was, of course, speaking about space affairs, and it's quite alarming that these defense officials know very little about space. It hasn't yet registered in the wider defense picture in many cases. But the events over the past week will mean actually that space is a lot higher on the defense agenda, if you like, than it was previously. And, what happens in space is essential for what happens down on Earth, whether that be military or civilian. In fact, there's a quote last year from Josep Borrell, who is I won't get into exactly what this function is, but he's what is known as the High Commissioner for the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the EU, or the High Representative, sorry. And yeah, he said, without any security in space, there is no security on Earth. The two are interlinked very intimately, and we have to, all countries, but especially in the messy case of the EU, we have to come up with a way of dealing with this. And as you have alluded to throughout this conversation, there are so many questions that remain totally unanswered. Not even, we're sort of getting there or something. There's no indication as to what the answer of these may be. We can guess as lawyers and as policymakers what they should perhaps be, but, you can't disentangle politics from this, and politics is set by power, and so you also have the dynamic of who is the most powerful in space. They will ultimately set some of these policies, at least from certain perspectives.
We really do need Superman to fall from the sky, don't we?
Yeah, I agree. As a lawyer.
Yeah. Yes, of course, and as my best friend, that too. All right, so where can people find and follow you and find your blogs?
Well, I predominantly post to the European Journal of International Law blog, EJIL Talk, it's abbreviated to. You'll sometimes find my work on there. The easiest way to see all of it, though, is if you look at my LinkedIn. If you just search up, I think Charlie JP Bennett is the user, same name as you used at the beginning, you'll find my profile, things I've been doing, things I've been writing about, and work at the Space Corps Foundation.
I can confirm, Charlie JP Bennett. No periods behind the J or the P.
Yeah, and this foundation has quite a big event next week, actually, where we'll be talking about some of the things we've been up to and the things we're looking to do in future. So it's an exciting time for me personally and for the wider industry. There's so much happening. If you're interested in space at all, this is a very good moment in time to be watching for what happens.
And yes, folks, for those of you who've been listening to Garden of the Doom and Garden Views, yes, this is another organization I'm involved in, like the NACON conference, where nobody can pay for me to go over to fun things in Europe. So no, I wasn't able to go to London. No, I wasn't able to go to Scotland. No, I wasn't able to go to Leiden this time. I wasn't able to go to Baku before, but I'm not exactly sure I would have wanted to go to Azerbaijan necessarily during the show. But maybe I would. Who knows? I don't. Given the opportunity, who knows? Let's just say I was brave and I wanted to go. But yeah. So what I think that all of you should learn is that Charlie is very smart and writes very important things that you should probably familiarize yourself with. And I am really good at getting myself part-time jobs that don't pay me and don't provide me any benefits. So be more like Charlie, less like me is the moral of this show. And if there's one thing I really hope to accomplish from the show is if you're in Norway, name the goddamn thing Bifrost.
I will tell every Norwegian with any voice at all to do exactly that. I think that's a brilliant idea.
I mean, jeez. I mean, you can
name the spaceport. Why the hell not?
Right. I mean, whatever the tower is, you call it Heimdall. I mean, it's right there, people, and it's basically your own stuff. It's not even like cultural appropriation, like if
comes
I
from
name
there.
Yeah, exactly right. So there you go. Hopefully I can enact this small policy as my contribution to Earth. Charlie, JP Bennett, I'm so happy that you did this. Thank you for playing along and adding your wisdom. Thank you for being very British with a stiff upper lip and your chin out the whole time and laughing when you were supposed to laugh instead of scoffing when you easily could have. And your time. And I look forward to working with you in the future and getting to know you and everyone else there a little bit better. I actually think the Space Corps Foundation is very important and can be really important.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, likewise, it's a pleasure to have this discussion, and yeah, we look forward to us having similar ones in the future, I hope.
Well, as the folks in Britain say, I know you're in the Netherlands, I don't know what they say, so I will say, brilliant. Folks, thanks for listening. If you get a chance, subscribe to the show if you're not already subscribed. Give us a like, give us a 5-star rating, give us a nice little review, and share the information with your friends. That's and maybe your enemies too, because if they get smarter, maybe they won't be your enemies any longer. Anyway, thanks for listening, and you'll hear from us next week, certainly in the Garden of Doom, maybe in Garden Views, but there'll at least be one a month. So thanks very much. Thanks again to our guest, and everyone, we'll hear from you next time.
I can feel you, I can hear you howling in my bones. There's an evil lurking in the dark. The ever-shifting skin is ripping as you take control. I can't tell where you end and where I start. A ferocious diagnosis under moonlit hands. Well, the man become the monster, or the monster become The bodies hit the dance floor to this heartbreak beat. I feel like somebody's watching me. Feels like everybody's watching me.